Hello, I'm Richard Woodruff, City Manager of the City of Jacksonville, and welcome to Land Use 201. This is the second in a two-part series which is intended to help you as the citizens and property owners of Jacksonville learn about land use regulations within our city. In an earlier series we called Land Use 101, we dealt with issues such as the future land use map, zoning, and also our subdivision regulations. Today we're going to focus in on the new regulations which we call the Unified Development Ordinance. But let's go back for a quick review. Who would like to tell us a little bit about future land use or zoning and subdivisions as we covered in Land Use 101?
I'll talk about zoning, Richard. Zoning, there's two parts to zoning. There's the land use map and the zoning text. The map zones every piece of property in Jacksonville's planning jurisdiction, in the city limits and the extraterritorial jurisdiction. We have residential zoning, we have zoning for small lots, subdivisions, zoning for medium-sized lots, and zoning for large lots. We also have zoning for office and institution uses, commercial uses, and industrial uses. The zoning text regulates what uses are allowed in each one of those districts. It also regulates the setbacks, the front setback, the side and the rear setbacks, the building heights, the parking requirements, the amount of land that can be covered by buildings, landscape buffers, and signage.
So zoning deals with the specific uses and how an individual parcel is developed. Well, if that's about the individual parcel, what about the future land use map? What does it do?
The future land use sort of sets a direction for the city in 20 years. The zoning deals with today and how land will be used in the present. The future land use predicts 20 years out sort of a vision of where we want to grow and where we want new commercial development, where we want residential to expand. So it's sort of, as we said last time, a crystal ball of what we want the city to be 20 years from now.
And then, of course, subdivision regulations, how do they fit into this?
Subdivision regulations is how the city governs the division of property or the recombination or movement of property lines. It's a tool that we use to lay out properties, make sure that they have proper street connectivity, proper infrastructure, and that we do not allow an overcrowding of land.
So from the future land use standpoint, we see the vision for the future. So as people, for example, drive out 17 or they drive up Western and they see undeveloped property, the city has a future land use map that talks about how that should be developed. So a citizen may look at that today and see that as agriculture or forest, but the city actually has a vision for it. Is that what the future land use does?
That's correct. It sets general broad categories such as regional commercial, neighborhood commercial, high-density residential, low-density residential. So it's not a specific plan necessarily, but it sets a general categories for what would work best in that area of town.
And then when I get ready to develop, let's say I own 40 acres out on Western Boulevard, and I get ready to develop that, I then come in and do what? File a rezoning application, or how does the process work?
Yes, you file a rezoning application if your property is not zoned for the intended use. That process goes through the planning board first for their recommendation, and then on to the city council for final approval.
And then once the zoning is in place and someone wants to actually develop a subdivision, then Jeremy, that's when we go into the actual subdivision process.
That's right, and we have categories of subdivision depending on how many lots a developer may propose, the availability of infrastructure, and again, the zoning does play in terms of the number of lots within that subdivision.
So that was a quick overview of Land Use 101. When it comes to Land Use 201, we're really dealing with the future and how we're going to regulate it from the standpoint of new regulations. Is that what we're dealing with?
That's correct. We're talking about adopting a Unified Development Ordinance, which will blend the subdivision regulations and the zoning ordinance, revise those to meet more current standards, put them in one ordinance together that outlines the approval processes and where you would go about to get those things approved, whether it be through planning board, city council, or the board of adjustment.
And Ryan, you said that we were unifying them into one document. That leads me to think that currently we don't have everything unified?
That's correct. We have a standalone subdivision ordinance and a standalone zoning ordinance. And the approval processes and everything that's in those two separate documents.
So the purpose of unifying them then is what?
To pull them together in one document for ease of use. It's also going to look at ordinances that were adopted in the 70s and modify them and modernize them.
So the current regulations the city is using, while they are not necessarily out of date, they are regulations that go back significantly in time. And it sounds that the Unified Development Ordinance really moves us into what I'll call the 21st century regarding development techniques.
That's correct.
What are some of the benefits of having a unified code versus having 3 separate codes?
I think one of the things that our Unified Development does is it adds diagrams and it's easier to use. So right now we have maybe 1 or 2 diagrams. In this new development ordinance, we have diagrams with every zoning district, kind of examples, so as from a user perspective, it's much easier to pick up and kind of figure out what's going on, being able to see it visually rather than just reading the text. It also adds a lot more flexibility with the regulations and enforcement, so we can kind of look at each case as it is rather than trying to do a one-size-fits-all, which we run into a lot with our existing ordinance.
Richard, another advantage when you have a unified development ordinance, when you make amendments to it, you pay more attention to making sure it's consistent with all the ordinances in the unified development ordinance. As you said before, our codes now are separated, so we have amended the zoning code and the subdivision ordinance over the last 20, 30 years, and sometimes we have amended the zoning ordinance and made it inconsistent with the subdivision ordinance. So one thing it does is make sure that we keep that consistency with all our regulations.
Another example of that would be the definitions section. Instead of having definitions in both the zoning ordinance and then one in the subdivision ordinance that may not be the same, you'll have one section that has all the definitions for the overall Unified Development Ordinance.
Well, I can certainly see how confusion could occur if you have 2 different documents with 2 different definitions. You know, we deal with those things on a regular basis, but if one, let's say a developer is looking at subdivision regulations and right-of-way is defined one way, but in the zoning code it's defined another way, or standards are different, it can certainly lead to confusion. Now, we use the term Unified Development Ordinance. I'm sure that somewhere in the vernacular of government we will come up with an abbreviation. So what are we going to call the Unified Development Ordinance?
We already have that. It's simply just UDO.
UDO. Mm-hmm. So for all of those who are watching today, there's a new term you need to get into your vocabulary, and that is going to be the UDO. Stands for Unified Development Ordinance. From the standpoint of creating this, I know that each of you are professionals, you have great educational background and experience, but did y'all write the UDO yourself, or how did the city create this?
We actually did not write it ourselves, although there's been a lot of parts of the UDO that we've had a hand in writing. It started with the growth management plan that City Council adopted, and one of the recommendations of that plan said you should create a Unified Development Ordinance, modernize your ordinances into one document. And we started that. We had a consultant that came in and sat down with City Council, sat down with the Planning Advisory Board, the city staff, as well as the development community and key stakeholders that City Council identified for the consultants, Clare and Associates, to sit down and go over what about our old code worked, what about our old code did not work, and that allowed them to basically prepare an outline and diagnosis on where they're going to take the current ordinances, make them new, modernized, and prepare that draft to present to city staff, which they did. City staff then reviewed the draft, made comments and recommendations, sent that back to the consultant. So that was where we had a hand in some of the writing of the ordinance. They then made the necessary changes, sent it back to city staff, and staff met with a steering committee that was appointed by City Council and went over it page by page and made sure that the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. It's a rather large document, and we went through that. And they did that in a series of 3 different modules, is what they called them. There's 9 articles total, and they broke those up into 3 modules. So we went through the first one, got it finalized, and then they came back forward with the second module. We did the same process again. Staff reviewed it, made comments, suggested changes based on the local environment, and shipped it off for them to make the final changes that they made. Then we met with the steering committee, went through that all over again. So that's what happened throughout the whole process, and now we've come down to the final version where, you know, all the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed, and we've got a final document that's ready for City Council consideration.
Well, it certainly sounds like that this has been a thorough way of doing it, but it must have taken the city a significant amount of time. I mean, this level of work is not done in a matter of months. How long have we been working on this process?
The consultant sat down with City Council and kicked it off in December of 2007.
So it's been a process that has taken a lot of input. You had a lot of citizen input, a lot of developers, a lot of City Council and the Planning Advisory Board. And of course that's essential because we want to make sure that the regulations which we create are not just simply regulations off of the shelf. They are regulations that are specifically tailored for the Jacksonville community and for the lifestyle we have here. Let's talk a little bit then. We talked about zoning earlier. Are you going to find zoning districts in the new UDO?
Yes, we're actually reducing the number of districts. Currently, we have about 30 districts, and I believe we're going down to about 15. So we will simplify that, but residential districts will remain residential, commercial districts will remain commercial. We're just combining some for some consistency and ease of use.
Now, when you talk about standards, we will have, of course, these standards from subdivisions and zoning all unified, which is a very good thing. When it comes, though, to the actual simplification, that's a term that you've used several times. I understand it was one of the goals of the City Council was to make this a simpler process, a simpler document. Can you give us some examples of how we've simplified the process?
Yeah, one big key thing there is we have a use table. Right now, currently, you have to find what zoning district you're in and then go to that section and look to see whether or not you can have certain things that are permitted in that district. And if you're looking at, well, I want to buy a piece of property and I want to be able to put a church there, you've got to go to each individual zoning district to figure out where you can place that church. With the new Unified Development Ordinance, you'll be able to go to one place, which is that use table, and you'll be able to see all the different districts that it's permitted within. The other thing is, as Abagail mentioned, we're condensing the number of districts. We found that the example that I would use would be the R7 and the RS7 are basically they're mirror images of one another. So this process, we're going to condense them down into one district so that instead of having 200 acres of RS7 and 200 of R7, we'll just have 400 of RSF7. Virtually the same thing that we have today. It's just simply blending those two together into the same district.
And the categories or the designators that you used, like RS7, what do those actually stand for?
Typically the R stands for residential. In this case it's residential single family, which means you would typically find a single family site-built home versus say a duplex or a quadruplex or apartment, multifamily.
So I'm assuming that if R stands for residential, something like a C must stand for commercial?
That would be correct.
Okay. So it does sound like we've done a good job of simplifying. Let's go back a second and talk about the use table. I remember at one point, I've never been a very good speller, and at one point I was learning how to use the dictionary. Mm-hmm. The problem with the dictionary, Reggie, is what? You have to know how to spell the word in order to look it up.
That's right.
But what you're saying now is that all you have to do is identify the use that you want. You go to one place, and that one place lists every possible use. So it's the use that is the entry point to using the chart. It's not the districts themselves.
Yes, that's the advantage the UDO has over our old zoning code. Like you said, Richard, the table lists about every use we can think of. And even if it doesn't list it, we can find a use on there that's comparable to it, and we can put it in that category, and that use would be allowed in all the districts that the other uses are allowed in. In the old code, we only had like 20 or 30 uses in each zoning district, and if the use wasn't printed there, then we took it as it wasn't permitted. So the old code was not as friendly as a UDO is going to be. Also, the UDO allows for some administrative flexibilities. So with setbacks, the director has the authority to give some administrative flexibilities within setbacks. number of parking spaces, landscaping. So this code is a lot more friendly user than the old code that we're using.
I know in the current code, if you wanted to deviate from a standard, you had to go through a formal process, which we call a variance.
Right.
And variances have to be shown that there's some type of hardship. But Reggie, I think what you're saying is that in this case, if I may use the term, the code has built in some common sense so that the department, and you specifically as the director, can look at the common sense of the request to really determine, do you actually need that 7.5 foot setback, or could it be reduced to 6 or some similar number? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. This code unties our hands where the old code tied our hands, where we had to send variances and all those things to the Board of Adjustment. It might take us 60 to 90 days to get to the Board of Adjustment, and as you said, they had to show some type of hardship to be granted the variance. So this gives us the ability as staff to look at it and see if it fits into what we're doing here in Jacksonville and make that decision.
Sounds like definitely a step in the right direction towards simplifying, but also a step to make government more user-friendly.
Yes, it does.
One other example of the simplification would be the diagrams that Abigail mentioned. With the diagrams, it provides a picture of the text, and anytime you can have an example, it certainly can eliminate some of the confusion that the text by itself may present. So that's another simplification process that we believe will be of great benefit.
Well, the old saying is what?
A picture's worth
1,000 words. That's right. So it sounds like we're heading in the right direction. We've unified the 3 different texts into one. We've simplified the use table. We've tried to make everything more user-friendly. We've simplified by putting in diagrams, which are certainly going to help, especially the average citizen who is not used to reading text or land use regulations. So this could certainly be of assistance to them.
Definitely a step forward.
Let's now talk for a moment about how we're going to engage the public when it comes to them becoming involved in learning about the UDO and how it impacts their specific properties.
I'll take how it impacts their specific property to start with. For the most part, if it's residential, it's remaining residential. There are no substantive changes there other than it just being easier to use if you need to use it. A lot of, as Ryan said, it was quite a lengthy process to go through from when we hired the consultant and working through all the modules. So in that time, we've actually adopted a fair amount of what we're bringing forward, such as landscaping standards, nonconformities, subdivision regulations that deal with some of the more commercial development. We will have some new regulations with commercial development, but as far as your normal single-family residential home, you won't really see any difference other than instead of being RS7, you're now going to be RS7. So just more or less a title change.
So really, if I'm out in Williamsburg Plantation or Carolina Forest or any of the newer subdivisions or maybe even some of the older subdivisions, you're saying that my titles might be changing, but if I'm single-family residential today, I'm basically going to be single-family residential tomorrow?
Yep.
What about commercial? Is that generally the same thing we're seeing?
We've got 2 commercial districts that will blend into one, although the current 2 districts are not very far away from one another. So there should be really a subtle difference between those 2. So instead of B1 and B2, I apologize, there's also a business district, although we don't have very many parcels zoned that way. So your business 1 and business 2 will blend together and become our quarter commercial district. But all in all, those will remain the same. Those in the business district may find that their property has a few more uses now that they've basically been upgraded. One of the things that we also went back to look for to make sure on the residential example, we did not create setbacks, new setbacks, that would cause any nonconformity. So if the current district had a 10-foot setback, we're not going to make that a new 15-foot setback. So there's not any nonconformities that would be created on the residential side as it relates to setbacks.
If a nonconformity does exist, and I guess we really need to ask the question, first of all, what is a nonconformity? What does that term mean?
A nonconformity is a use or a current existing use that doesn't meet the code as it stands today. If a home was built 30 years ago, and the city council has adopted new setbacks that at the time of the home was built, if it was a 50-foot setback, and now we have a 60-foot setback, it's more than likely that home is built too close to the road. Most of our nonconformities can rebuild if they're damaged, or can expand as long as they're not increasing their nonconformity. However, if the building home was to be demolished or removed, any new development would have to meet our current code. They would no longer meet the old code.
So while it's been one of our goals in the new UDO to try to avoid the creation of nonconformity, if such was created, it really doesn't mean that the current use of the property has to stop. It doesn't mean that that property owner can't do what he has been doing with the property.
That's correct.
Okay. When it comes to public education, what are we doing to move forward to help educate the public on the new UDO?
Well, we're doing a number of things, primarily this very video conference, and including our Land Use 101 and now Land Use 201. We've included with our utility customers, they had flyers in their last utility bill. We are holding a series of town hall meetings right here at City Hall where the public can come meet staff, review UDO documents, ask any questions or address any concerns they may have, and they will have the opportunities to look at their property and compare it of the old zoning to the new zoning.
As Jeremy just mentioned, we will have some town hall meetings here at City Hall on February the 25th and March the 11th from 4 p.m. until 7 p.m. It will basically be come when you're able, come ask the questions of staff. We'll be able to pull up your information on property if you have any questions, and try to get the word out. And I believe there will also be a few more utility mailers as well.
Now, I believe we've also set up a website where people who may not be able to come down can look up their property specifically. How does that work?
You would be able to go to the webpage and type in your address, and it will basically identify your current zoning, your proposed zoning, and it'll also give you a description of what the zoning district is and what it will be.
Well, thank you all for joining on Land Use 201. We encourage you as residents and property owners of the City of Jacksonville to become involved in learning more about the Unified Development Ordinance, or as we'll call it, the UDO. Remember, you have opportunities to come in February and March to meet with individual planners. You don't have to schedule an appointment. There will be no formal hearings at those meetings. It will rather be a drop-in session. So we hope you'll avail yourself of that, or again, use the website to look up your individual property. Thank you for joining us on Land Use 201.